Hello. Welcome and thanks, first of all, to Niall, Jerry and Viola for their efforts that has brought us here tonight. And obviously for you for all coming out to hear Simon and Leanne at this 6th year of the Seamus Heaney Lecture. Only another 94 to go for the centenary. Before we proceed, just a few comments on the life of Seamus Heaney. I recently returned to Friends School Lisburn. I think they must have lost my school reports, to speak about themes of conflict, transformation and reconciliation. It was an event that brought together kids from different religious and cultural backgrounds. Friends was clearly a Quaker school, given the name, and it was an oasis of multiculturalism and liberalism within those very dark and sinister days of sectarian onslaught and chaos. So when I talk to the young people, I use Seamus Heaney as a way to understand how he was so important in taking people away from the sterile and pitiful terrain of side-taking. How he convinced us that the identities that we were given were not as deeply rooted as we believed, that Heaney told us our identities could be plural. When I was at Friends School, most of the kids who were there when I was there were religious. When I spoke to the kids that day, the pupils that day, most of them were not. I can only thank God. Being at Friends took me back to English lessons. And as I've said, the school was a very diverse place. It was the only place, I think, in Northern Ireland that had Catholic, Protestant, Jew, Hindu, non-believer, all in one place. And of course, English was a great site, a great place to be if you were somebody who was liberal and somebody who wanted to enjoy and embrace what culture gave you. So Heaney, Joy Division, Stiff Little Fingers, George Orwell, Susie and the Banshees and Ska were all part of that teenage years that I lived together. All of those things meant to me that culture was opportunity, that culture was something to embrace. And of course, it fitted in with teenage angst. I forgot to mention the Smiths. So English class also had people there who didn't want to be there. Because as you remember in those days, English and maths were obligatory. So those of us who wanted to be there embraced what we were presented with. But there was a group in the class who preferred science and maths, and they were evangelical Protestants. They were mostly rural, and they were far from affluent. They belonged to these churches that had split and split and split and split and split again over a word in the Bible. They were literalists. We used to call them the Tin Hutters. And as you remember, if you remember the old days in Northern Ireland, all of these little semi-permanent tin huts, that were their churches, that were once dotted all across the landscape. Their churches had these wonderful names, like the Aaron Hall, the Nazarenes, non-subscribing, the Independent Church of this, and the Reformed Church of that. Ironically, some were even named Free. Feel a bit of William Blake coming here. Thou shalt not, written over the fence. Evangelicals were not people for image or symbolism. That was Catholic. That was continental. Or that was the sort of thing that posh Protestants were into. Literature and drama were tools of idolatry. Literalism triumphed over everything. But these were not people who lacked intellect. Many became notable scientists. Many became surgeons. Many became important scientists. They liked science because it mirrored their literalism. Probably proved God didn't exist, but that was probably something they ignored. So we used to mock them about their accents, and they mocked us. We were townies, and they were culchies. So when I was back in the school, I had this memory of that division between those who were there in sufferance and those who were there like a sponge absorbing culture about them. And I have to say, the memory that came back to me was one of the most deadpan readings of Hamlet. Okay, Leanne, you're a very good actor. Tom and Ray, you're a very good actor. You could never, ever reproduce the impassionedness and expressive nature of an evangelical Protestant reading Hamlet. To be or not to be, that is the question, followed by the teacher, who was an enthusiastic, liberal, genteel individual who was trying to get us to be energetic and to love culture and identity, turned around and says, "Harold, why did you sigh?" He says, "Miss, it's all just waffle and a lot of nonsense." But there was one time in English class that the evangelicals engaged. Heaney. Their interest levels would rise. They lived under the cross-stitch samplers in their homes, what Heaney calls text in the other side. Those samplers read, "Cleanliness is next to godliness. Today I live in faith, or I make music for the Lord." No artwork, as Heaney observed, but the power of the literal word. Literally upon the wall. If those samplers were not poetry, then what is poetry? Words, whether evangelical or otherwise, were always around Seamus Heaney. His talent, we were talking about this earlier, Simon, his talent was his ability to merge the literal with the figurative. Sorry, I'm going on a bit here. I'm not here to do the lecture. You can tell me to go at some point. The people he wrote about early in his career knew the land, respected the land, and were like him, products of the land. Heaney's genius was not merely that he knew people, but he could connect the determined literalist with the symbolic dreamer. He, as we know, spoke through the local to the universal, and was as relatable to the Palestinian refugee as he was to the Holocaust survivor, as he was to the survivor, to the grieving mother, and both perpetrator and victim. So whether in the kitchen of rural Ulster, whether it was the body of the kirk, as Heaney wrote, or whether you had the child of the Prague on the mantelpiece, as someone from a Protestant background, I don't know what that is. What is that little... all very strange. Heaney knew what divided us and what divided his neighbours was paralleled by what also bonded and bounded people. He knew that rural Catholics and Protestants were people of faith and devotion, living within respective patriarchal dictums. He knew the land, knew my heritage, and he knew, irrespective of their background, that the most important issue is the Massey Ferguson better than the Fergie when you talk about tractors? So he understood that these people were divided, but they were also kindred. And I'm sure, as we know, people in those communities would have laughed at the young man from Balahi who was talking about making a living through writing on a page. But of course, when he became famous, he was one of them. So maybe at the end of the day, we can conclude with a lot of confidence that Heaney's work will remain relatable. It will never be obscured for the simple fact that if you can speak to evangelical Protestants, you can literally speak to anybody. So, we are going to have some readings in a minute. I have to do an introduction. Leanne has brought her partner today, who actually changed his flight to be here because he's a Seamus Heaney fan. Okay? And as Leanne said, he wouldn't do that for me. So as you know, Leanne is from... You're in trouble there, aren't you? I shouldn't have said that, sorry. So Leanne is from this great city of Liverpool, and she now lives in that London. Leanne was in Star Wars, and we've had many people here from Star Wars reading the poems, and here also for the Beckett Festival. The only person I think we haven't had yet is R2-D2. And I think the way AI is going, That's probably next year. There's something that you were in recently, Leanne, which was just brilliant. Cotton Wool. I don't know if anybody's seen Cotton Wool. It's on Amazon, and I really think you should watch it. It's basically the story of a 7-year-old child who has to look after his ill mother. It's one of those dramas that remind you that despite a long day and the issues that are going on in your life, maybe your life is not as grueling and demanding as you think. Beautifully played by you as the mother. And it is one of those dramas that speaks to the whole lack of social cohesion, protection and support for children who take on adult roles when they should be children. It speaks to our times and the erosion of the welfare state and how that affects many young people. So you played a lot of roles, you won numerous prizes, rightly so. You've been in our line of duty, so you know our friend Adrian Dunbar, who does the Beckett Festival. I believe you also know Jimmy Nesbitt. You have my condolences. You walked into that one. The laugh tells me that's appropriate. So Leanne will read 3 poems for us tonight. The Other Side, from Wintering Out, Casualty, from Field Work, and Alphabets, from Hall Lecture. Leanne, thank you.
What a privilege to be asked to read these poems in these times. But I'm not convinced it's not always been these times. So this is the other side. Thigh deep in sedge and marigolds, a neighbour laid his shadow on the stream, vouching, it's poor as Lazarus, that ground, and brushed away among the shaken leafage. I lay where his Lear sloped to meet our fallow, nested on moss and rushes, my ear swallowing his fabulous biblical dismissal, that tongue of chosen people. When he would stand like that, on the other side, white-haired, swinging his blackthorn at the marsh weeds, the prophesied above our scraggy acres, then turn away towards his promised furrows on the hill, a wake of pollen drifting to our bank, the next season's tears. For days, we would rehearse each patriarchal dictum. Lazarus, the Pharaoh, Solomon, and David and Goliath rolled magnificently, like loads of hay too big for our small lanes. Your side of the house, I believe, hardly ruled by the book at all. His brain was a whitewashed kitchen, hung with texts, swept, tidy as the body o' the cake. Then, sometimes, when the rosary was dragging mournfully on in the kitchen, we would hear his steps round the gable, though not until after the litany would the knock on the door come, and the casual whistle strike up on the doorstep. A right-looking night, he might say. I was dandering by, and says I might as well call. But now as I stand behind him, in the dark yard, in the moan of prayers, he puts a hand in his pocket or taps a little tune with the blackthorn shyly, as if he were party to love-making or a stranger's weeping. Should I slip away, I wonder, or go up and touch his shoulder and talk about the weather or the price of grass seed? Alphabets. A shadow his father makes with joined hands, and thumbs and fingers nibbling on the wall, like a rabbit's head. He understands. He will understand more when he goes to school. There he draws smoke with chalk the whole first week, then draws the forked stick that they call a Y. This is writing. A swan's neck and swan's back make the two. He can see now, as well as say. Two rafters and a cross tie on the slate are the letters some call R, some say A. There are charts. There are headlines. There is a right way to hold the pen and a wrong way. First, it is copying out, and then English, marked correct with a little leaning hoe. Smells of inkwells rise in the classroom hush. A globe in the window tilts like a coloured O. Declension sang on air like a hosanna as, column after stratified column, book 1 of Elementa Latina, marbled and minatory rose up in him. For he was fostered next to a stricter school, named for the patron saint of the oak wood, where classes switched to the pealing of a bell. And he left the Latin Forum for the shade of new calligraphy that felt like home. The letters of this alphabet were trees. The capitals were orchards in full bloom. The lines of script like briars coiled in ditches. Here, in a snooded garment and bare feet, all ringleted in assonance and wood notes, the poet's dream stole over him like sunlight and passed into the tenebrous thickets. He learns this other writing. He is the scribe who drove a team of quills on his white field. Round his cell door the blackbirds dart and dab, then self-denial, fasting, the pure cold. By rules the hardened, the farther they reached north, he bends to his desk and begins again. Christ's sickle has been in the undergrowth, the script grows bare and Merovingian. The globe has spun. He stands in a wooden O. He alludes to Shakespeare. He alludes to graves. Time has bulldozed the school and the school window. Balers drop bales like printouts where stucked sheaves made lambdas on the stubble once a harvest. And the delta face of each potato pit was patted straight and moulded against frost. All gone, with the Amiga that kept watch above the door, the good luck horseshoe. Yet shape note language, absolute on air, as Constantine's sky-lettered in hoc signio, can still command him. Or the necromancer who would hang from the domed ceiling of his house, a figure of the world with colours in it, so that the figure of the universe, and not just single things, would meet his sight when he walked abroad. As from his small window, the astronaut sees all he has sprung from, the risen, aqueous, singular, lucent O, like a magnificent and buoyant ovum. Or, like my own wide, pre-reflective stare, all agog at the plasterer on his ladder, skimming our gable and writing our name there with his trowel point, letter by strange letter. Casualty. He would drink by himself and raise a weathered thumb towards the high shelf, call in another rum and black currant without having to raise his voice, or order a quick stout by a lifting of the eye and a discreet dumb show of pulling off the top. At closing time would go in waders and peaked cap into the showery dark, a dole-kept breadwinner but a natural for work. I loved his whole manner, sure-footed but too sly, his deadpan, sidling tact, his fisherman's quick eye and turned, observant back. Incomprehensible to him, my other life. Sometimes on his high stool, too busy with his knife at a tobacco plug and not meeting my eye. In the pause after a slug, he mentioned poetry. We would be on our own and always politic and shy of condescension. I would manage by some trick to switch to talk of eels or Lord of the Horse and Cart or the provisionals. But my tentative art, his turned back watches too. He was blown to bits, out drinking in the curfew. Others obeyed. 3 nights after they shot dead the 13 men in Derry. Paris 13, the wall said. Bogside 0. That Wednesday, everybody held their breath and trembled. It was a day of cold, raw silence. Wind blown, surplice and soutane rained on, flower laden. Coffin after coffin seemed to float from the door of the packed cathedral like blossoms on slow water. The common funeral unrolled its swaddling band, lapping, tightening. We were braced and bound like brothers in a ring. But he would not be held at home by his own crowd, whatever threats were phoned, whatever black flags waved. I see him as he turned in that bombed, offending place, remorse fused with terror in his still knowable face. His cornered, out-faced stare blinding in the flash. He had gone miles away, for he drank like a fish, nightly, naturally swimming towards the lure of warm, lit-up places. The blared mesh and murmur drifting among glasses in the gregarious smoke. How culpable was he that last night when he broke? Our tribe's complicity. Now you're supposed to be an educated man, I hear him say. Puzzle me the right answer to that one. I missed his funeral, those quiet walkers and sideways talkers shoaling out of his lane to the respectable pairing of the hares. They move in equal pace with the habitual, slow consolation of a dawdling engine. The line lifted, hand over fist. Cold sunshine on the water. The land banked under fog. That morning, when he took me out in his boat, the screw paling, turning indolent fathoms white, I tasted freedom with him. To get out early, haul steadily off the bottom, dispraise the catch and smile as you find a rhythm working you, slow mile by mile, into your proper haunt, somewhere well out, beyond. Dawn sniffing revenant, plodder through midnight rain, question me again.
Thank you. Brilliant. Thank you. Simon, if I were to read out even a part of your CV, we'll be here to midnight. So I think just to say that the audience tonight and the number of people here is testament to you being one of our most notable public intellectuals. You'll all be familiar with Simon's work on television, the history of Britain, the story of the Jews, and civilization, and in the past while, the excellent story of us and the road to Auschwitz. Now, I probably shouldn't tell you this, but the reason why I was telling Simon earlier on, the reason why I knew Simon was very much fascinated by Seamus Heaney was I was watching Chelsea, and I've got to a certain age that when my football team is losing, I just can't tolerate it. And I switched over. I was going to watch the series later, but I switched over, and there was Simon talking about Seamus Heaney. Okay? So the official story is, Simon is a great public intellectual, and we couldn't wait for him to have here. The true story is, Chelsea were losing again, and I turned over the television. I think it's important that we understand not only the TV work, but one of the most important books I read as a PhD student is Landscape and Memory. And I would encourage anybody who hasn't read Landscape and Memory to get a copy. I think one of the best things about that book is where Simon argues that wilderness is no different from, as somebody ordered in the book now, wilderness is no different from the manicured garden. And we were talking about this earlier, how nature gives us hope and how important it is to all of us. So Simon, his ability is akin to Heaney, narrative construction. So people of my generation and older were taught history via stories, riddled with curious detail. Those of us who've had kids in the last few years, who've gone through the O-level, A-level system, it seems that all you do in school now in terms of history is World War II. Yeah, there was a bit before that, it's called history. Okay? So not only did Simon in this series of looking at Britain and reminding us of the things that were achieved in this country, multiculturalism, feminism, cultural brilliance and all of that, but I do hope that that's also related to a younger generation who understand that history is narrative, it's an exercise in narrative. So returning to the road to Auschwitz, last week was the 87th anniversary of Kristallnacht, the poem we just heard, 53 years since the egregious events of Bloody Sunday. And last week was 38 years since the horrors of the Remembrance Day bombing. I think what's really, in Enniskillen, I think what's really important to understand is when you've come out of a conflict or you live in an ideology of conflict, the starting point of coming out of any conflict is to listen. Is to understand the opposite, is to understand the antithesis, and it is to find what Seamus did in his work, which he'll talk about, mutual respect and parity of esteem. So I'm sure these things will come up in the talk tonight. So let's have a very hearty welcome for this year's Seamus Heaney Lecture, Politics and the Poet. Thank you.
Thank you so much, dear Peter. I wish I could have told you that it was your fault for watching Chelsea and you would have been better off watching my football team. But my football team, alas, is catastrophically worse even than Chelsea. So it would done you no good at all. Thank you so much. Thank you, Leanne, for that incredibly moving set of readings. Really, without presuming, Seamus would have loved that. I'm sure. And thank you, Heaney family in the Estate, for asking me. It's an extraordinarily great and, of course, terrifying honour, especially in a year when the beautiful volume of poetry, complete volume of poetry, including some uncollected poems, has been published. So it is daunting because your lecturer this evening, as you'll already be aware, is deeply stuck in prose. Such is the fate of historians, so I take heart from classical scholars telling us that Herodotus, called by Cicero the father of history, wrote his work as a series of short performance pieces to be recited or even sung at public games. I myself have long believed that history without poetry, or at least a poetic sensibility, is a discipline with one hand tied behind its back. Whether the reverse is true, though, may be more arguable. And it's that question which much preoccupied Seamus, the battle between the inescapability of history and the obligation of the poet to elude its summary bulletins, the better to protect the independence of verse that I want to talk to you about this evening. Not least because this was, as I say, an issue repeatedly thrust on Seamus, but which he also opposed to himself, often unsparingly, not least during the times we were colleagues and friends together at Harvard in the 1980s, and which he answered, as we've just heard in Casualties, through a kind of poetic indirectness, the in-between quality our friend Helen Wendler caught when writing about his work. Heaney's was a relationship with politics that was marked by the sidelong moves of human experience, so that even the tentative soundings out of the other side's Protestant and Catholic neighbors carries an incomparably deeper and more hopeful truth than the tinny cant of armed ideologies. Which is one of the reasons that while his work is, among other things, the peerlessly eloquent document of modern Ireland, it continues to resonate through the entire calamity-burdened world. Seamus did not look away, he just looked at it differently. The quickening of spring and acts of murder, both within vision. In the first of his Redress of Poetry lectures at Oxford, Heaney characterized poetry as, quote, the imagination pressing back against the pressure of reality. And in Flight Path in 1996, famously, he made that clear to a man on a train to Belfast. And you'll have to forgive me for my English speech here. I wish it were more Irish. So he enters and sits down opposite and goes for me head on. When, for fuck's sake, are you going to write something for us? If I do write something, whatever it is, I'll be writing for myself. And that was that. Or words to that effect. Danny Morrison, the Sinn Féin spokesman in question, later protested that this was an overly raw account of a relatively polite meeting, to which Seamus responded that may have outwardly been the case, but the poem nonetheless conveyed how he felt when cornered by the reprimand. Seamus was not the first poet to ponder the contest between public obligation and literary independence. It runs like a red thread through the canon. Shakespeare, Milton, and especially Wordsworth, whom Seamus credited as a model for his grafting together of human action with the workings of nature, they all wrote during times of violent national crisis, looking face on to bitter conflict, yet resisting the road rage of polemic. Sometimes the times overcame poetic shape-shifting, sometimes not. So I'll be keeping company with you with those other poets this evening, but always with an eye and an ear on what Seamus might have said, and doubtless, while I do so, sensing that familiar, attentive look of his, kindly yet exacting, humorously serious, an expression often of benevolent correction. How I miss him. There is a book of Jewish mysticism, possibly written as early as the 3rd century, that I first read in a child-friendly form when I was around 10, known as the Sefer Yetzirah, the Book of Formation. The myth that most enchanted me was that God had created the elements of the universe out of single Hebrew letters. Thus, air was created from Aleph, and sounded out breathily. Flowing water, mayim, from the letter mem, and so on. Now, there's no Hebrew vowel for the long O, but the short form, O, is made from the consonant vav with the diacritical nikud dot above it. But it occurred to me, even at the age of 10, that there should have been an O letter, since otherwise, why would God have formed the earth as a sphere? This all came back to me when I heard Seamus lecturing at Harvard in 1985, riffing off that single letter you've just heard in Leanne's beautiful reading of Alphabets. O, the risen, aqueous, singular, lucent O, the oceanic earth from which life first sprang and which magnifies, as the poem goes, the buoyant ovum of the womb. The astronaut epiphany through the porthole recovers in this circle of alphabetically indexed life. The O of the globe hanging in Seamus's schoolroom window, tilted to display the angle of orbit, then reappearing as the domed ceiling of the studio of the Renaissance philosopher and astrologer, whom we know as Marsilio Ficino, with its suspended figure of the world. Time then passes, the globe spins, and Heaney the pupil is replaced by Heaney the teacher, the one I listened to 40 years ago, and realized all of my intellectual settings were being rebooted. Alphabets describes the venue, Sanders Theatre at Harvard, as a wooden O, which strictly speaking it isn't. It's more a hemispherical arena within a Gothic revival building. But of course, the allusion is to a more famous and more circular venue, Shakespeare's Globe. That association took me, while I was sitting there, I have to say, time traveling, back to a particular place in a particular moment. The proscenium stage of the Old Vic in London in November 1955. The play was Shakespeare's Henry V. The King was played by Richard Burton just before his 30th birthday. 4 years earlier at Stratford-on-Avon, he'd gone from an unknown to immediate stardom in the same role, his voice accurately described by Kenneth Tynan as a brimming pool running disturbingly deep. But the time travel set running by Seamus's allusion to the wooden O didn't stop with the 10-year-old me in 1955. It raced further back all the way to Southwark, 1599, late spring or early summer, the debut season of Philip Henslow's Lord Chamberlain's men in their new home, beyond the reach of the London magistrates, and where, according to some scholars, including my colleague James Shapiro, the season began with Henry V. If that was so, then the first sound out of the mouth of the first actor to appear in the first performance on the stage of the Globe, which happened to be the first time I ever heard Shakespeare perform live by anyone other than my wannabe thespian father, was the letter word, O. The exclamation, as Seamus pointed out, describing, perhaps with a play of hands and arms, the shape of the theatre itself. Oh, for a muse of fire that would ascend the brightest heaven of invention, a kingdom for a stage, princes to act, and monarchs to behold the swelling scene. Then should the warlike Harry like himself assume the port of Mars, and at his heels, leashed in like hounds, would famine, sword, and fire crouch for employment. But pardon and gentles all. I want to stop there just for a minute on that all, the embrace of audience kinship. Chorus that evening was played by John Neville, believed with good reason to be Burton's peer. They alternated as Iago and Othello the same season. As the O left his lips, Neville threw, I'll never forget this, an enormous scarlet cape across the stage, so that he appeared as a kind of wizard, flattering the audience into believing it was in every sense as much their show as the company's. Piece out our imperfections with your thoughts. But who's the you? Everyone within the O, now promoted to gentles all. Gentry in the boxes and groundlings in the pit. In here we're all the same, an indivisible community of the imagination. 'Tis your thoughts that must now deck our kings. This gesture of shameless social ingratiation was taking place against a grim background. The late spring of 1599 saw anti-enclosure riots, sky-high food prices, following a succession of bad harvests, press gangs taking men for the Irish War, and a spasm of fear that Spain was preparing to launch a second armada. So there was an urgent reason for audience togetherness. The divided country turned into a band of brothers. All of which makes the writer-actor of Henry V sound like a propagandist for hire, which, if we compare the set speeches in Henry V with, say, Falstaff's demolition of the cult of honour in Henry IV, Part 1, played for the first time 3 or 4 years earlier, perhaps Shakespeare had indeed become. Nothing could be further from the fraternity of Agincourt than Falstaff's pitiful rascals who are food for powder. Had Shakespeare begun an expedient moral retreat, a perpetuator of the cult of honour he demolished in the earlier Henriade? Not when you get to Act 4, Scene 1, a moment of such unexpected dramatic awkwardness that is often shrunk or cut entirely from modern productions. On the eve of battle, Shakespeare suddenly performs an abrupt swerve from consolatory fantasy to the sour, fearful reality of grunts by the campfire. John Bates and Michael Williams, in Kenneth Branagh's movie, played as Judi Dench loves to remind us by her husband, whose name was Michael Williams, very well, if you look at the film. The tonal gear shift is made more jarring by Shakespeare abandoning iambic pentameter. The grunts' home truths spoken to their betters can't be done with the polished armor of blank verse, may have been his thought. It needs down and dirty. It needs prose. It's preceded, though, by a predictable Band of Brothers up-cheering moment between the king and devoted veterans like Sir Thomas Erpingham and Henry V's actual brothers, Bedford and Gloucester. Then comes the prose, first in comic inversion when Pistol asks the disguised king if he is officer or art thou base, common or popular. What are you, says the king. As good a gentleman as the emperor, says Pistol. Then you are better than a king, says the actual king. The king, says Pistol, is a boarcock and a heart of gold, a lad of life, an imp of fame. Pistol is remembering nostalgically the brotherhood of rogues in Eastcheap. He's remembering Hal. But Falstaff is dead, and Bardolph would exit this play on a gallows. The little touch of Harry in the Night goes only so far. The spell of majesty as commoner, slumming in effect, fails when encountering the bloody-minded gloom voiced by Bates and Williams, as close as the tetralogy ever gets to a class collision, and quite at odds with the chorus's picture of the poor condemned English like sacrifices sit by their watchful fires and inly ruminate the morning's danger. Nothing inly about what Bates and Williams have to say. There is in the chorus's prologue to Act 4 a candid concession to eve of battle terror, given the long odds against the more numerous French. And again, when Henry repeats Erpingham's pessimism about the likely outcome, as men wrecked upon a sand that looked to be washed off in the next tide. But in answering Bates's question, whether in that case had Erpingham said as much to the king, Henry, the disguised Henry, says no. Nor 'tis meet that he should, the reason being that it might weaken the king's obligation to be outwardly courageous, a hard task, since, when all is said and done, the king is but a man as I am. Bates replies, he may show what courage he will, but I believe, as cold as night as his, could wish himself in Thames up to the neck. And so I would he were, and I by him at all adventures, so we were quit here. Unnerved, Henry gets defensive. By my troth, I will speak my conscience of the king. I think he would not wish himself anywhere but where he is. Bates, then I would he were here alone. So should he sure to be ransomed, and many a poor man's lives saved. Thoroughly shocked now, Henry offers courtly defence. Methinks I could not die anywhere so contented as in the king's company, his course being just and honourable. And this cues a devastating retort from Williams, not just an early version of "I but to die, go we know not where," but unmistakably the voice of the grunt through the ages, loud and clear. That's more than we know. To which Michael Williams adds that it was all pointless to rehearse anyway, since he and his mates were helpless subjects anyway. Terrier-like, though, he adds, should the cause turn out not to be just, there would be heavy reckoning at the day of judgment, when all those legs and arms and hands chopped off in a battle shall join together and cry all, "We died at such a place," some swearing, some crying for a surgeon, some upon their wives left poor behind them, some upon the debts they owe, some upon the children rawly left. As the scene goes on, Henry moves from shock to anger, the self-serving myth of chaps in it altogether so brutally disposed of. He can only recover by strenuously contesting the notion that the king could possibly be responsible for his subjects' pointless death. The soldiers shuffle off into the grim dawn, and so does Shakespeare's insolent skepticism. Re-enter iambic pentameter for a philosophical soliloquy of self-justification that borders on self-pity. Upon the king, let us our lives, our souls, our debts, our careful wives, our children, our sins lay on the king. We must bear it all, O hard condition. The glimmer of bad moon rising in his head is finally laid to rest by another round of showtime for the troops. Crispian, the restoration of the myth of family with a big helping of anaphora repetition. We few, we happy few, we band of brothers, for he who sheds his blood with me shall be my brother. Be he ne'er so vile, this day shall gentle his condition. A promotion as made in the promise by chorus to the globe groundlings. So what do we make of the campfire scene? A courageous moment when all the patriotic pieties of fellowship get stuck in the throat of their inventor, or yet more proof that Shakespeare was opportunistically hedging his bets, as he does by a nearly even distribution of political sympathies in Julius Caesar, also first performed at the Globe in 1599, or the politically perilous Richard II, a play that makes the case both for and against deposition of a monarch at the very moment, remember the Queen, very old, no heir, the very moment when that seemed to be more than a remote possibility. Or was the subversive voice of the campfire soldiers evidence of Shakespeare's multivocal shape-shifting, giving voice to opposing sides while dodging incrimination by association, ensuring he wouldn't end up in prison like Ben Jonson or dead like Christopher Marlowe? At first sight or listen, Shakespeare's reach for everyman lingo in the campfire scene seems a measure of his political daring in the guise of talk back to royal pretensions of brotherhood and battle. It raises profound issues of accountability for war, prizes open a moment of consciousness, as Seamus did all the time, in the king who otherwise fancies himself as the people's warlord. The voice of Michael Williams drives a pike through those self-serving delusions. Making that gnarly skepticism credible meant not just giving the people their disagreeable voice, but paying close attention to catching the sound in which they spoke it. None of which was the principal concern of a 22-year-old writer whose first printed poem was an epitaph for Shakespeare, intended to preface the 1632 second folio. It's safe to say the poem gives little sign of what John Milton was to become, retreading as it did mechanical couplets, familiar pieties that Shakespeare's works, rather than any sort of marble sculpture, ought to be considered his true monument. What need my Shakespeare for his honoured bones, the labour of an age, piled in stones, and so on? But around the same time, there was one instance of Milton paying homage to a celebrity character who was very much of plain stock, the carrier, Thomas Hobson, who once a week ran a coach service from Cambridge, where Milton had been an undergraduate, to the Bull Inn in Bishopsgate. Hobson had died on New Year's Day, 1631, never recovering, so it was said, from an enforced suspension of his usual run due to a visitation of the plague. Milton's couplets were not all that far from doggerel. Here lies old Hobson, death hath broke his girt, and here, alas, has laid him in the dirt. And surely death could never have prevailed had not his weekly course of carriage failed. Not exactly Samson Agonistes at this point, is it? But it's worth noting, I think, although this kind of thing may not have sounded the genuine vox populus, but a kind of comic pastiche of it, it does actually touch down in one authentically popular genre. The verses, over 200 of them, written by John Taylor, the water poet who actually appears in Landscape and Memory, makes a kind of walk-on role, and self-made celebrity who wrote invariably in those kind of couplets, and was also in the people carrying business, this time on Thames ferries. Taylor was very famous, a lowbrow national treasure, his poems a popular institution, far more widely read than those, say, of Michael Drayton. When in 16 he attempted to row the length of the River Thames in a boat made of hempseed paper so that he could write about the expedition, we got the following poem as a result. The water to the paper being got in 1/2 hour began to rot. Our rotten bottom all to tatters fell and left our boat as bottomless as hell. I have to ask for Seamus's forgiveness at this point, clearly. But this was a nationally publicised event. Although Milton's little rhymes, it's safe to say, did not come naturally to him, even though in many respects he was something of a student thespian, both of the Christian epic and a stager of masques and entertainments that began with his vacation exercise in Christ's College. But all these were voiced in the allegorical classical language, of courtly culture. When in 1639 he returned to England from Italy, it was to a country that was in crisis, one so profound that poetical flourishes seemed inadequate. And adequacy was something that Seamus kept on using the word, actually, when he was thinking about this tug of war. Inadequate to the gravity of the moment. I decided, he wrote in May 1641, to devote to the conflict all my talent, my active powers. He was, as he knew, a bit late in his mission to liberate Christians from their captivity by the bishops, the prelacy of the official church. The pendulum had swung sharply away from the king. Parliament was already discussing the abolition of bishops. Archbishop Laud was in the Tower accused of treason. Protestant polemics were everywhere. So when Milton published anonymously his first prose attack on the bishops of Reformation, he made sure to charge it with the rhythmic stress and graphic picturing that we associate with poetic invention. Hence his play, again with an aphora, rhythmic repetition. When the prelates, the bishops, instructed their flock that reverence demanded ritual, here's Milton, they hallowed it, they fumed it, they sprinkled it, they bedecked it, not in robes of pure innocency, but of pure linen, with other deformed and fantastic dresses in palls and mitres, gold and gewgaws, fetched from Aaron's old wardrobe, the biblical high priest with all his fancy dress. When Milton wants to describe the bishop's role in replacing true piety with these kind of formulaic gestures, he compares their compromised doctrine to, quote, a seething pot set to cool, sensibly exhale, and reeking out the greatest part of that zeal on those gifts that were formerly in them, settling in a skinny congealment of ease and sloth at the top. Such a queasy temper of lukewarmness gives a vomit to God himself, Milton wrote. And this isn't the only time Milton returns to the kitchen for his similes and to metaphysical conceits for his technique. The obscene and surfeited priest scruples not to paw and mammock the sacramental bread as familiarly as his tavern biscuit. In 1640, Milton had become tutor to the sons of his sister. His tract, this one of Reformation, turns all of England into his pupils. It is a good work and prudent to be able to guide one man, he writes, but better yet to guide a nation piously and justly, which only is to say happily. That ambitious political calling, which Milton believes he must now embrace, is of the greatest importance to the life of man, as he writes. Yet there is no art that hath been more cankered in her principles, more soiled and slubbered with aphorizing pedantry than the art of policy, political writing. Only a true writer, he implies, a true poet, which is to say, one who mobilizes the language of ordinary as well as extraordinary people, has the linguistic wherewithal to make the necessary correction. And with Areopagitica in 1641, the first of his prose works to have his name on the cover, Milton brings all of these literary poetic powers, even though it's prose, to bear on his argument against pre-publication licensing, in effect, pre-publishing censorship. The Presbyterian-dominated Parliament, now sovereign in place of divine right monarchy, had nonetheless restored that censorship of the defunct royal government. Worse, its argument for so doing is that the common people, regular folk, need protection from scurrilously corrupting publications. But this, Milton says, positioning himself as the champion of the common reader, is to insult their intelligence, all the more so since the licensers may themselves be more unlearned than those whom they claim to protect. But to make that point, Milton has to picture poetically, almost dreamily, that commonwealth of the mind. And he does so in one of the most, I think, beautifully affecting passages in all of English political writing. Behold now this vast city, this is London, behold now this vast city, a city of refuge, the mansion house of liberty, encompassed and surrounded with his, God's, protection. The shop of war hath not there more anvils and hammers, waking to fashion out the plates and instruments of armed justice in defence of beleaguered truth, than there be pens and heads there, sitting by their studious lamps, musing, searching, revolving new notions and ideas, wherewith to present, as with their homage and their fealty, the approaching Reformation. Others as fast reading, trying all things, assenting to the force of reason and convincement. This is Milton's free London, or rather, as he would want it to be. Much happened, of course, not least in the intolerant Cromwellian state that Milton went on to serve, to make that a pipe dream. But around 150 years later, on we go, in a poem called London, 1802, William Wordsworth, surveying what he thought was the moral collapse of the country, summoned the shade of Areopagitica. Milton, thou shouldst be living at this hour. England hath need of thee. She is a fen of stagnant waters, altar, sword, and pen. Fireside, the heroic wealth of hall and bower, have forfeited their ancient English dower of inward happiness. We are selfish men. Oh, raise us up. Return to us again. Selfish men mistake poetry for entertaining finesse. Wordsworth thought at this point in his career exactly that. He was over his ardent romance with the French Revolution, repenting the defense of its violence he'd written in a letter to the Bishop of Llandaff. And he wrote in this way, this is in 1793, just barely back from France. In that letter, he wrote that the obstinate perversion of men is such that she is obliged to borrow the very arms of despotism to overthrow him, and in order to reign in peace must establish herself by violence. But after seeing what Robespierre's dictatorship had done, He wrote to his friend William Matthew, "I now recoil from the bare idea of revolution. I am a determined enemy of every species of violence." Nonetheless, something remained from Wordsworth's original encounter with revolution at its idealizing dawn, and that something was social fraternity, or what Adam Smith, in the theory of moral sentiments, had called sympathy, and we commonly call empathy, meaning the capacity to identify with the sufferings of others. One of the most affecting passages of the Prelude, begun in the same year as writing the Lyrical Ballads with Coleridge, 1798, recalls a roadside encounter with a hunger-bitten girl who crept along, fitting her languid gait unto a heifer's motion by a cord turned to her arm. The poem then reports Wordsworth's close friend, the army captain Michel Beaupuy, exclaiming, "'Tis against that which we are fighting." And the poet goes on, "I with him believed that a benignant spirit was abroad, which could not be withstood, that poverty as abject as this would be found no more." Wordsworth's ballads, especially The Female Vagrant and The Last of the Flock, are all meetings with the unfortunate whose lives and livelihoods have been destroyed. And they all sprang from this deep well of social sympathy, radicalism minus the speeches and the guillotine, not a revolution of blood and fire, but a revolution in poetic form, momentous all the same. The activist poem without billboarding itself as such. The advertisement for the Lyrical Ballads declared it to be an experiment, written with a view to ascertain how far the language of conversation in the middle and lower classes is adapted to the purposes of poetry. Away then with redundant classical allusion and what had long been accepted as poetic diction, but was the work of the poets who merely think they are conferring honor upon themselves and their art in proportion as they separate themselves from the sympathies of men and indulge in arbitrary and capricious habits and expressions in order to furnish food for fickle taste. I love it that, at the end of a little kind of mini polemical tract, he can't escape alliteration or doesn't want to. Furnish food for fickle taste. Wordsworth wrote in the preface, published in 1801, "I wish to keep the reader in the company of flesh and blood." How's that for a pre-Heaneyite sentiment? A poetical project, then, of social solidarity. The subject of the Lyrical Ballads would be, quote, "incidents from common life, described insofar as possible in the language used by men, over which would be thrown a certain colouring of the imagination." I'm still quoting the preface. Humble rustic life was where the essential passions of the heart are under less restraint and speak a plainless and more emphatic language, because less under the influence of social vanity, and crucially for Wordsworth, as he said, more directly connected with and formed by nature. Another poet, however, begged to differ, and that someone inconveniently was his co-author, Coleridge, who years later, in 1816, in his Biographia Literaria, published a slightly but tellingly different account of the origins of the Lyrical Ballads. The discussion of the friends and Somerset neighbours, as they were, he wrote, turned on the two cardinal points of poetry: the power of exciting the sympathy of the reader by a faithful adherence to the truth of nature, and the power of giving the interest of novelty by the modifying colours of imagination. But there was to be an equal division of labour and pages between the two concepts and styles. "My endeavours," Coleridge wrote in retrospect, "should be directed to persons and characters supernatural, or at least romantic," think Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner, which begins the Lyrical Ballads. "Yet so as to transfer from our inward nature a human interest and semblance of truth, sufficient to procure for these shadows of imagination that willing suspension of disbelief for the moment that constitutes poetic faith." Mr. Wordsworth, on the other hand, was to propose to himself as his object to give the charm of novelty to things of every day, and to excite a feeling analogous to the supernatural by awakening the mind's attention from the lethargy of custom and directing it to the loveliness and wonders of the world before us. An inexhaustible treasure, still Coleridge, an inexhaustible treasure, but for which, in the consequence of the film of familiarity and selfish solicitude, we have eyes yet see not, ears but hear not, and hearts that neither feel nor understand. But this, Coleridge wrote, with the most backhanded compliment that you can think of, was not what came to pass. That was the work premise, the manifesto set out. Mr. Wordsworth's industry proved so much more successful, and the number of his persons so much greater, that my compositions, instead of forming a balance, appeared rather an interpolation of a heterogeneous matter. Ouch. Being downsized would not have mattered, nor Wordsworth taking it upon himself to define enduring poetry, that which was written with the voice of the rustic poor, had he not gone into print with a preface, which, given that both their names appeared on the title page, would lead readers to suppose he was in agreement with his friend's prescription, that real poetry was the poetry of the voice of the ordinary people. Such, Coleridge made clear, was definitely not the case. He went on to raise awkward, sometimes unfriendly questions. Why was it to be assumed that the voice of the impoverished was suitable for poetry? If, as Wordsworth claimed, a constant association with the objects of daily life, your work, objects, utensils, produced the best part of language, then he said the distinct knowledge of an uneducated rustic would furnish a very scanty vocabulary. Yes, I know it's terrible stuff, but it's sort of brilliant too. The best part of language, properly so called, is derived from the reflections on the acts of the mind itself. That's exactly, of course, what Coleridge had in mind when he wrote Kubla Khan, which is all about the psychology and effect of creativity, isn't it? But even if it were granted that the everyday speech of rustics was somehow the root of a strong poetic language, was that actually the language of the female vagrant or the last of the flock? Everything depended on word order. What Wordsworth had written, this is in The Last of the Flock. It's the opening of The Last of the Flock, which is a beautiful poem. In distant countries I have been, and yet I have not often seen a healthy man full grown weep in the public roads alone. But such a one on English ground and in the broad highway I met. Along the broad highway he came, his cheeks with tears were wet. Sturdy he seemed, though he was sad, and in his arms a lamb he had. But, said Coleridge, the pub version would have gone something like this. I've been in many parts far and near, and I don't know I ever saw before a man crying by himself in the road, a grown man, I mean, that was neither sick nor hurt. Departing from common speech to make poems needed no apologies, said Coleridge. Wordsworth's social sympathies should not have precluded him from owning up to that poetic language was a kind of supercharged language. Insisting that his ballads were the real thing was in effect patronizing ownership, belied by the incontrovertible fact that the most superb of his verses, and Coleridge absolutely did think they were superb, Tintern Abbey, for example, all those used speech that might have been habitual in cottage and factory, but also, Coleridge wrote, in court and palace. Nor should poets have to apologize for the particularities of their art facing inward as much as outward in inevitable speech selection, idealized vocabulary, meter, word order used to generate pleasure, and especially the pleasure resulting from taking the reader through the windings of the verses themselves to the expectation of a denouement. Obviously, a lot of this criticism came from undisguised envy. Snarkily, Coleridge noted that Wordsworth's admirers were found not in the lower classes of the reading public, but chiefly among young men of strong ability and meditative minds, their admiration inflamed, perhaps, by some degree of opposition, distinguished by its intensity, I might almost say its religious fervor, in other words, students. It suited the conservatively re-minted Coleridge of 1816, one which not only had turned its back on revolutionary past but tried to pretend he never had one, to poke fun at Wordsworth's pretensions to make poetry out of rough speech, rejecting, this is Coleridge's version of Wordsworth, but not inaccurate, as vicious and indefensible all phrases and forms of style that were not included in what he, this is so Coleridge, rejecting as vicious and indefensible all phrases and forms of style that were not included what he, unfortunately, I think, wrote Coleridge, called the language of real life. But it's striking to me, at any rate, that through the many chapters of Biographia Literaria, which is actually a great read, spent on puncturing Wordsworth's pretensions to be a champion of people's poetry, Coleridge refrained from criticizing three of the qualities of Wordsworth poetry that has ensured for all the rest of us their endurance, which were also the reasons, I know, Seamus held him as a model for his own work. First, the preoccupation with memory and the wiring together of inward reflection and outward vision or outward event. Second, the expression of the world through exact, concrete descriptions of nature. And finally, and most grandly, but an article of faith for Seamus as well as Wordsworth. This is Wordsworth at the end of the preface to the Lyrical Ballads. In spite of difference, of soil and climate, of language and manners, of laws and customs, in spite of things silently gone out of mind, and things violently destroyed, the poet binds together by passion and knowledge of the vast empire of human society as it is spread over the whole earth and over all time. Poetry is the first and last of human knowledge. It is as immortal as the heart of man. That message would be echoed in the New York lecture hall by Ralph Waldo Emerson in 1842. 10 years earlier, when poetic vision has displaced Emerson's fading Unitarianism as a guide to piercing the truths of the cosmos. Emerson had actually gone in search of the two men who personified this visionary aspiration of poetry, Coleridge and Wordsworth. His trip to Europe was meant to revive the life spirit that had all but extinguished in the wake of the death of his 20-year-old wife, Ellen, a shock so deep that Emerson had opened her coffin only a year later, to attempt a communion. This was more of a habit in New England than you might actually think in the 18th. Horrifying though it is. He resigned from his Unitarian ministry and sailed off in pursuit of the poets. The pilgrimage was a disaster. Coleridge in Highgate, a year away from his own death, was crazed, incomprehensible, addicted, of course, embarrassing. Up in the Lake District, wearing green goggles, Wordsworth pontificated about the Americans, their relentless lust for money, their obsession at a low level, politicizing everything. Who knew? And walked the visitor down the gravel path where many of his poems have been composed. As a way of understanding how poetry might replace over-institutionalized religion, the visits were colossal failures, though in one respect at least they were positive, because they led Emerson to begin composing the essays and lectures that became his own transcendentalist mission. In 1842, with his name as a prodigious and powerfully eloquent performer well established, Emerson delivered one such lecture called The Poet in New York City. In the audience, overwhelmed by what he was hearing, was the editor of the Brooklyn Daily Eagle, Walt Whitman. Two of Emerson's themes particularly stirred him. The first was the exalted status of the poet. This is Emerson. Representative, he stands among partial men for the complete man. In the hurtling world of modernity, the poet stood as the sayer of indispensable truths, an evangelical savior from the tyranny of materialism. Secondly, again, echo of Wordsworth, it was a mistake to confuse self-proclaimed connoisseurs of art and literature, mostly drawn to elegance, with true culture. That redeeming force was out there in a world beyond the salon, in the thrumming life of the people, where the much-awaited, authentically American poet Redeemer would eventually be discovered. Such a man would speak, said Emerson, not of wealth, but commonwealth. As I say, much of this echoed the preface to the lyrical ballads, but the people who populated the Wordsworth ballads were essentially the humbled rustic poor, and their voice was fatalistic, defeated. Emerson wanted a poetry that shrugged off the deep sigh of the ruined cottage. He wanted verse that slipstreamed behind America's tailwind of common energy. Emerson. Our topography, our stumps and their politics, our fisheries, our Negroes and Indians. Can't censor Emerson. Have to platform him. Our boats and our repudiations, the wealth of rogues, the pusillanimity of honest men, the western clearing and Oregon and Texas are yet unsung. So still Emerson's extraordinary. Yet America is a poem in our eyes. A poem in our eyes. Its ample geography dazzles the imagination, and it will not wait for meters. The identical sentiment appears in the preface to Whitman's Leaves of Grass, self-published 13 years later in 1855, pumped up to an improbable national anthem. This is now Whitman. The Americans of all nations at any time upon the earth have probably the fullest poetical nature. The United States themselves are essentially the greatest poem. Here is not merely a nation, but a teeming nation of nations. Here is action untied from strings, moving in vast masses. Here are the ruffs and beards. Just such a rough-bearded fellow with an open-neck shirt, coarse trousers, and hat at a rakish angle appeared on the title page of the Leaves of Grass in place of the author's name. The hero poet of America did not just canvass its terrain, Whitman. He incarnates its geography and natural life. This is the preface to Leaves of Grass. On him rise solid growths that offset the growths of pine and cedar and hemlock and live oak and locust and chestnut and cypress and hickory and tangles as tangled as any canebrake, with flight screams that answer those of the wild pigeon and orchard oriole and coot and surf duck and red-shouldered hawk and fishhawk and white ibis and Indian hen and cat owl. You get the idea. Whitman sent an unbound copy to Emerson, who thanked the author for the wonderful gift, his words, the most extraordinary piece of wit and wisdom America has yet contributed. I give you joy of your free and brave thought. I greet you at the beginning of a great career. Whitman, no slouch, then sent the letter to Charles Dana to be published in the New York Tribune. Most reviewers were thunderstruck by what they read, not least because it bore no resemblance whatsoever to poetry as generally understood, no meter, no rhyme, no stanzas. Poetry in 1855 was Longfellow's Song of Hiawatha. Or another Longfellow poem, The Rainy Day. This is Longfellow. The day is cold and dark and dreary. It rains and the wind is never weary. The vine still clings to the mouldering wall, but at every gust the dead leaves fall. The day is dark and dreary. What the handful of readers got when they opened Leaves of Grass was this: the smoke of my own breath, echoes, ripples, and buzzed whispers, love root, silk thread, crotch and vine, my respiration and inspiration, the beating of my heart, the passing of blood and air through my lungs, the sniff of green leaves and dry leaves, and of the shore and dark-colored sea rocks and hay in the barn, the sound of belched words of my voice, words loose to the eddies of the wind, a few light kisses, a few embraces, a reaching around of arms. Stop this day and night with me, and you shall possess the origin of all poems. Quick, pass the sal volatile. Oh, he didn't write that, that's me. Of the 800 print run, only 300 copies of the Leaves of Grass were sold. Hiawatha sold 50,000. In the world of letters, Emerson found himself the only Whitman enthusiast. Someone wrote that what he and Whitman had in common was temporary insanity. But the project, in many ways, was what the lyrical ballads had advertised: free verse for a free people, a long verse line emulating the wagon-rolling frontier. Psychic communication between poet and the natural world had, of course, its great exemplar in Wordsworth's Tintern Abbey, but in Whitman's case, the river was for naked swimming. And, this is Whitman, limitless, limpid jets of love, hot and enormous quivering jelly of love, lost in the cleave and clasping and sweet flesh day. Emerson implored Whitman to cut this bit, which the poet replied would be tantamount to emasculation. Once again, the form of the poems that were supposed to make them popular as well as modern was so shockingly at odds with conventional expectations, it of course uncut exactly that ambition. There were moments, though, when Whitman's version of high style, which in the mind of the poet, Whitman's mind, and indeed Emerson's, did indeed so owe something to Milton and Shakespeare and Wordsworth, all gods in America in the 19th century, did land in popular sensibility. And what saved Whitman's poetry, not just for disappearing inside pagan mysticism or the throb of sexual egomania, both unlikely to win mass appeal in America at that time, was direct contact with ordinary folk, not speeding along in locomotive enthusiasm, but stalled by history's catastrophic violence, which is really why I wish I'd talked about Whitman with Seamus, and I so regret not doing. And I don't know that he ever, maybe somebody knows. I'm not sure he wrote about Walt Whitman, actually. No, I don't think so either. It's too bad. In December 1862, Whitman read the name of his brother George among the lists of the Union, wounded at the Battle of Fredericksburg. Traveling as fast as he could, Whitman had his pocket picked en route, so arrived in Virginia penniless. But he found his brother seriously but not mortally wounded in a hospital camp across the river from Fredericksburg. When George was on the way to recovery, Whitman rode back with the wounded to Washington, where he became a wound dresser, official job description, assisting surgeons as an orderly, but also, most touchingly, as a comforter, roaming the wards with a backpack filled with what he knew the soldiers needed: tobacco, brandy, notepaper and envelopes to write to their loved ones, crackers, oysters, peaches, and on hot days, ice cream. This already sounds like a poem, doesn't it? But the free verses of that profound experience, alas, often which he wrote as he was doing this job, often collapsed back into pseudo-biblical posturing. Jesus with the knapsack. Over the carnage rose prophetic a voice: "Be not disheartened, affectioned shall solve the problems of freedom yet. Those who love each other shall become invincible," and the like. At other moments, though, at the bedside of the wounded, a horrified, compassionate realism does take over. Whitman smells the gangrene, replaces blood-clotted sheets, and invents the modern war poem. This is Whitman, from a collection called Drum Taps. From the stump of the arm, the amputated hand, I undo the clotted lint, remove the slough wash of the matter and blood. Back on his pillow, the soldier bends with curved neck and side-falling head. His eyes are closed, his face is pale. He dares not look on the bloody stump and has not yet looked on it. Nothing like that exists in mid-19th century literature anywhere, except perhaps the dressing station chapters, which are so amazing in War and Peace. But poetically, the problem of Drum Taps, the name of that collection, are its swings between high rhetoric, which you heard, and this versified reportage, even as gripping as it is. There's no midway. There's none of the elusive touch in Seamus's verses, in which the country world proceeds in fields and farms and ponds as calamity builds in the sky or on the ominous road or in a bus station. And yet Whitman does find his footing, I think, when his idol, Abraham Lincoln, who he saw almost every day in Washington, riding out protected by a cavalry detachment, saber assault, was assassinated on April 14th, 1865, just 9 days after General Lee had surrendered to Grant at the Appomattox courthouse. Whitman's first response, famously, was a howl and a sob. "Oh, Captain, my Captain, our fearful trip is done. The ship has weathered every rack, the prize we sought is won." You notice that Whitman now is actually directly engaging with meter and with cadence. "The port is near, the bells I hear, the people all exulting, while follow eyes the steady keel, the vessel grim and daring. But oh, heart, heart, heart. Oh, oh, the bleeding drops of red. Oh, where on the deck my captain lies, fallen cold and dead." The second response is one of the great, I think, threnodies of English literature. When lilacs last in the dooryard bloomed finally achieves what had been so long eluding Whitman, the parallel universes of nature's indifference and human calamity that brought together within the lines of a poem make a trauma just about bearable. So Whitman has the lilac blossom and the hermit thrush sing its call as Lincoln's coffin processes down roads lined with the grieving. Here's Whitman, just a bit of the poem. "Coffin that passes through lanes and streets, through day and night, with a great cloud darkening the land, with the pomp of the in-looped flags, with the cities draped in black, with the show of the states themselves as of crape-veiled women standing, with processions long and winding, and the flambeau of the night, with the countless torches lit, with the silent sea of faces and the unbared heads, with the waiting depot, the arriving coffin and the somber faces, with dirges through the night, with 1,000 voices rising strong and solemn, with all the mournful voices of the dirges poured around the coffin, the dim-lit churches and the shuddering organs, where amid these you journey with the tolling bells, perpetual clang. Here, coffin that slowly passes, I give you my sprig of lilac. Down to the shores of the water, the path by the swamp in the dimness, to the solemn shadowy cedars and ghostly pines so still, and the singer so shy to the rest received me. The grey-brown bird, I know, received us comrades three, and he sang the carol of death, and a verse for him I love. There's only one other near contemporary composition written in the historical sublime that matches or even surpasses Lilacs in its poetic expression of the burden of loss, along the possibility of a new beginning. In 272 words, and if you'll forgive me, almost at the end, I'm going to read them all, it delivers the entirety of a national epic and the meaning of public mourning. It is at the same time heroically confident and deeply modest, wrongly as it would turn out, about the impotence of words to affect the brutality of deeds. Much of its power comes from the deployment of poetic device, dramatic alliteration, listen for the F's in the first sentence, assonance, poor power, heavy anaphora, selective lines of iambic pentameter. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, sharp turns of tense, a final chant-like repetition, like the tolling of a funeral bell. It comes to us in formal disguise as a speech. Its author had internalized Cicero's De Oratore and Shakespeare's rhetoric. So can it be thought of as a poem? Or just a brief utterance before an audience of 15,000 on the very same day as this, November the 19th, 180 years ago in Pennsylvania. The speaker was inaudible to most. The speech was panned by the press. And after it was over, Lincoln turned to his bodyguard and said, in a Seamus-like figure of speech drawn from the talk of farmers that was Lincoln's native vernacular. Well, layman, that was his bodyguard. Well, layman, that speech won't scour, which meant plough on a harrow. Formally prose, it seems to me to speak precisely to what Seamus in his Nobel Prize acceptance speech credited to the power of poetry. The power to persuade that vulnerable part of our consciousness of its rightness in spite of the evidence of wrongness all around it. The power to remind us we are hunters and gatherers of values, that our very solitudes and distresses are creditable insofar as they too are an earnest of our veritable human being. So I'm hoping he wouldn't have minded this recitation, last recitation. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived, so dedicated, can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those here who gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honoured dead we take increased devotion for that cause which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
I think they enjoyed that. Thank you very much, Simon. And in a few moments' time, after we award the Heaney Prize, Simon will go downstairs and we'll be signing some books. Okay? So we aren't taking any questions tonight. You'll have access through the book signing. Okay? Right. Where is Jack Hatton? Come over here, Jack. Okay. All right, Jack, this is Jack. He's the winner of this year's Heaney Prize, which is the best undergraduate essay. And in 30 years' time, he'll be given the Heaney Lecture. Okay. So Jack wrote a brilliant essay on James Joyce, body cycles. The filled body, the empty body, consumption, and the consumed. Is this correct? I'm going to break GDPR rules and tell everybody that you got 80%. Okay? I think that's some achievement. Excellent, very well done. So your essay was an original reading of Joyce's representation of the body and the way in which Joyce's dialectic showed the body to be essential to the mind. Is that correct? Yeah. Okay. And we're delighted if the Heaney brothers will come up. Come on up, Chris. Yeah, get a photo opportunity. So,
Sorry about it.
all right. So, So just to say, we used to give an envelope with nothing in it, okay? Not because we're stingy evangelical Protestants, but because you get that when you graduate. And I'm sure with 80%, I think you might be graduating very, very soon. So thank you very much for that. Thank you. So, thank you very much for that superb lecture and such an evocative ending. I think that was, that really summed up the whole nature, and I think also clearly your respect and empathy for Seamus Heaney came through very clearly within that work. Leanne, your readings clearly showed the empathy for the importance of prose, and I think the merit of the lecture is not just about the merit of Seamus Heaney, but what we discussed earlier, Simon. The hardest art form is poetry. Do not try poetry if you are not good at it. Okay? Try history, try geography, try Olympic swimming. Do not try poetry because you're going to make a fool of yourself. Okay? And I think very much just to congratulate Simon again for such an impressive lecture tonight. So there will be a glass of what do we evangelicals call alcohol? The devil's buttermilk. There will be a glass of the devil's buttermilk downstairs, and most of all, I always say this, we can't do these events unless you come to them. And we very much respect the fact that you put so much store and support in us also. So thank you to you as well.